All right, we're going to directly talk about reverberation spatialization. One of the first things we want to talk about, we've talked about it some up to this point. I'm going to talk about how I approach it and how I use it. To me, that we talked about keeping it very simple. The first thing is that we don't have a binaural environment. We've got two speakers. So what we have is stereo, and we have two sides, and we have a plane of reverb that can come back to us. And the other part of reverb is character, a frequency response that can actually build character in that. Now, one way that I want to point out really quick is you can put delays in series and build delays in series to emulate a frequency response in the delay aspect to avoid any character. That way, if you've done a lot of work on sculpting the sound that you're working on, and you don't want to add any character to it, you can put delays on it that way and put them in series to build, an impulse response or a simulation of it that has no character to it. That's just delay, and it's a really cool tool to save yourself some headache there of trying to figure out what impulse response or what reverb has this type of character by building it with just delays. So really keep that in mind. The other thing is that, when you're dealing with that, is that, you can't deal with it in a binaural situation. So try to really keep it in your mind that you're dealing delays and a plane, and that's what you got to work with, and try to keep it that simple in your head. And the other aspect of that is that you understand that, the first way to approach it is that in your capture that you want to use the character and the frequency response of a room to actually use it as a tool for your capture. And the other way to look at it is you want as clean a capture as you can get, so almost anechoic chamber, to where it's, it's as clean as you can get it, so you can do any spatialization work you want to do in the studio. And a lot of times that's a lot better way to approach it to avoid mud, depending on what your production is. So there are two ways that you have to see reverb, and two ways that you can, go about trying to capture it, and then two ways that it's done outside in the room, and you've spent time on the acoustics of the room for the capture, or you've really tried to isolate the capture to where you're getting no response and no frequency response from the room, or as little as possible, to do spatialization inside of the DAW. So those are the two, some real important things to keep in mind. The other thing, you look at it's bouncing all over the place, from the up, down, right, left, all over the place. We're already talking about that you're not even dealing with that type of environment when you're trying to mix it in the studio after the capture, and the actuality that whatever it is captured gets, interpreted as two planes in stereo, so, what is that doing to the actual capture? Sometimes good and sometimes bad, and really take that into consideration. The other part is that, like we had talked about, this is it's two-dimensional. So you're looking at like this impulse response, and you're looking at, the first response or the first sound, first reflections, reverberations, early reflections, and late reflections. And the issue can be any one of these reflections or these points can be, bounced off of that wall that hit that reflective device, or bounced off that wall that you would put some diffusion stuff on, or reabsorption, panels or something. And so they might be a little bit different, have different frequency components, frequency response. Those things can add, to that. And, all the other aspects of what, of the acoustics that we've talked about could be affected somehow or in there. And it can be really hard. And I'm going to show you in the next video why I sculpt my frequency responses so that I can avoid a lot of that altogether, because I try to keep it as simple as I can so that those issues are dealt with, for the environment that I'm working in. So the next aspect I'm looking at is how do I approach it? Well, let's take a simple example. I've got this vocal I recorded. So I doubled the track. I panned 150% right, 150% left. On the one that's on the left, I put 24.4 millisecond delay on it, and I detuned it 3 cents, okay? And so there, the spatialization and the panning, now that I've dealt with the spatialization, and one of them's off to one side or the other, one of them's got some delay on it already that's actually building stereo field there already and some stereo effects. And I've done some detuning on it, on one side of it to add body to it. The next thing is I'll choose an impulse response that I've worked on for that vocalist, and it's got the frequency response and the impulse response I want, and I'll put a separate one of them on the right and on the left. That way that delay is on the left is affecting it differently than the one on the right, even though it's the same delay, which starts building, not only is it building space right and left with those delays and the reverbs coming on at different times, but it also is building space front to back. That means that you hear it and then it's dying out, but it's decaying differently. Does that make sense? And, lightly, that's building all kinds of space. And one of the biggest things that I push is go light, especially that you're doing this kind of stuff with every instrument on a track, that, too much can really muddy your mix. And I'm always a proponent of go light. You can hear something happening, and okay, back off a little bit, maybe push it just a little bit, and because it's all that stuff's going to be happening to every instrument you work on. And if you do too much of it, you can start getting a muddy mix. You can always go back later in the mix once you've done it to all your instruments and all the stuff that you're working for your stereo field and your spatializations, and add a little bit more later. Or when you have something that just directly calls for reverb, and then, you have to approach that a little bit differently. So basically that's real simple, and that type of, structure works really well for building that space, in the environment that you have to work with. And also, like if you've got, let's say you got the guitars panned left and the bass panned right, and this could be any type of situation. Well, it's a really good idea to take that guitar that's on the left, duplicate that track, put it on the same panning off to the other side, and drop the volume way down. I mean, way down. But do that same work on it. And you'll be amazed that even though that your ear perceives it over the left, that it's still got adding stereo character and spatialization to the mix, because it's still lightly over on the other side with different delays and different reverbs and different tunings off to the other side that add spatialization. And you can take that to extremes with a vocal that's at a solo at a section, and you've panned them all over the place at different delays, different tunings, and different reverbs that can add huge spatial effects. And you can only do so much in a plane with just stereo field and pannings to work with, but that works really well and deals with that situation real well. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, and we had already talked about delays, instead of putting this reverbs on here at the end of it, you can always build that with delays. Get a decent delay and put a few of them in series that have a delay effect setup that is emulating like an impulse response. And that removes the character. That way that if you've spent a lot of time sound sculpting something and you don't want anything to affect the sound of it, nothing, no kind of frequency response, you can do that stuff with reverbs or with delay, just delay effects that are going to do basically the same thing, but remove any character that might get added to the sound. So keep that in mind and experiment with that. The next thing I wanted to talk about is if you go back and watch the video I did on mixing, there's one called Bodybuilding, and you will understand that the first phase of after I get done with the captures, to build body on that. And I'll use most reverbs, normal reverbs, I'll use that for. I'm almost always go to the convolution reverb when I'm working, because I'll sculpt my own impulses that are going to do what I want them to do, or I use delays. I'll take, delays in series. That way I get no character. I've sound sculpted that vocalist just the way I want them. I don't want no kind of frequency response interfering with anything I've done. So I'll build series of delays that act like an impulse response but add no character to the sound. And it works real well like that. So, but you got to be real careful, because some delays that you get, that they might add some character, and, real simple parts. I mean, there's lots of different delays that do lots of different things, but simple things like dampness, humidity, population, how many people are in the room or objects are in the room, reflexivity, how reflective the surfaces are, those kind of things can be really cool. And we'll get into that into the next video. But for the most part, that you have to look at that. If you look at that as a sound sculpting tool, you'll be better off. I deal with it from impulse responses, because I got a much better view of what it's doing, rather than, does that sound good? Does that not sound good? Do I add more dampness or more population? I'll actually go do this to my impulse responses and then render them down as a piece of audio and put that into my actual convolution reverb after I've done some work on it. That way I know what I've done to it very well, and it's very much focused on what I'm working on. All the different parameters and all kinds of different reverbs that you can get can do all kinds of different things. I got a whole bunch of them in my studio, and reverbs and delays, I got tons of them. I got a few of them that I just go to. I love my open air in Studio One. I mean, it does what I mean, by the time I get done building my impulse response, I just need that thing to project it, and I might do a little bit of work on it, but not normally much, because when I start doubling tracks and panning things around, then I really want that thing messing with what I'm doing. And I know that sounds messed up. Some people go, oh my God, it's like, well, because I know that I only got 2 speakers to work on. I don't want to get mud going. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible to avoid, complex issues unless I'm using them as a tool to get something done. And most of the things that I look in Reverb is that, for a section or a certain application that, I'm going to have a reverb, those, most of the time, that's what I use those tools for. I mean, you pull out any reverb and you start looking at it, most of those tools that, are doing some specific things or some cool things, that they're for very specific applications for me that doesn't have anything to do with spatialization. That has to do that I want the listener to hear reverb, you know what I'm saying, in some way, some type of reverberation effect and delay effect. They're going to know there's delay or reverb, and that's a totally different concept of dealing with this acoustics and trying to build spatialization. And that can get very in-depth also, but the base, if you keep it as simple in your mind as you can, that it really isn't that complex, the reverberations and delays and the character, those 3 things, and those 2 instruments and the 3 things that they do there, or the 2 things that they do there, and not get them confused in your mind about what that's doing. So I hope I made that real simple. We'll get into the next video about sculpting frequency responses and stuff, but I mean, you can see here really simply that this is, the frequency response of just a Hall, impulse response I got. Then I put some EQ on it, and then you see it there. Well, if I go back and show it to you again, like in a waterfall, I mean, you see that frequency response there, and then you look at it there and you look at the difference. I mean, I've contoured this here to actually, really do some cool things, to actually, so that it's not just reverberation with a little bit of character. I mean, I've built the character to it. I've built the type of reverberation, how it's going to decay, everything about it. I've built, from scratch. Well, I started out with an impulse response and then started sculpting it. So I hope that made that real simple in the understanding of how to approach that. And, some of the things, I mean, all these things can be very different from one production to another, and how you, actually, apply this kind of stuff to what you're doing. But it's all very pertinent in building that spatialization, that panning, and that stereo field, and building that space from front to back, so that those 2 areas, so that spatialization, is as filled as possible in that stereo field as it can be, since you can't represent, a binaural effect. And that way works real well and does a real good job to get that done. And like I said, one of the biggest things that I say is just go light. You can always go back and add more. You add just a little bit, and and see what's going on, because as you start putting all those instruments together and all those different pannings, that you've panned out I mean, you spend all kinds of time on your stereo field and all this delay stuff and all the detunings, putting separate reverbs on either side of them, and you've got your panning and your spatialization front to back. I mean, it's beautiful. It's awesome, dude, and it's like, that aspect of it, and it's cool because then you filled it just like you have the spectrum when you're working on a symphony. You filled every aspect of it from the spatialization perspective as well as you could with the tools that you have. So there's lots of other approaches, but I try to keep that as simple as possible. If you work at it with understanding the spatialization aspects, like I've said here, that it should make your job much easier and you able to do a much nicer production and with clarity of what you're doing. So I hope that was clear. I hope that was fairly easy to understand, and I'll see you in the next video about sculpting the impulse responses. Peace, hope, love.